Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, today, folks, we are going to be partaking in some practical knowledge about engines. And to be specific, we are only going to be talking about cylinder engines in this podcast today. We're not going to be talking about rotary engines or turbine engines, because rotary engines have been known to be used in cars, especially by Mazda back in the day. And we are going to be talking about the cylinder engines, and we're not going to be talking about Chrysler turbine engines that they were put in like one concept car back in the day either. We are talking simply about cylinder engines. Today we are going to be covering the different types of engines. I find that it is a common misnomer that people who are not privy to cars tend to call any engine a V engine. This is not the case. There are actually several different ways you can arrange cylinders in an internal combustion engine, and today we are going to be exploring those different types of engines. You are going to be learning about I engines. You're going to be learning about V engines. You're going to be learning about flat engines, and you're going to be learning about the rare W engine. So please stay tuned, buckle your seatbelts, and this is the GSMC Car Podcast. So, to begin, in segment 1, we are going to be discussing inline engines. Inline engines are probably the most common engine configuration, considering the fact that inline engines are typically put in smaller, cheaper built cars, such as economy cars, or in a lot of European cars, inline engines are put in there. These are probably the most common form of engine, considering the fact that they are the simplest to build. They only have one cylinder head because all of the cylinders are arranged in a straight line. Inline engines are probably the most common. Most modern cars with four-cylinder engines have I4 engines. This is not to say that all four-cylinder engines are I4 engines. There are V4 engines. Those are not very common at all. And there are also flat 4 engines. But most of the time, four-cylinder engines are I4 engines. Like I said, they have a very simple design. Very simple design as in there's only one cylinder head. So it's not like you've got two cylinder banks and each needs its separate cylinder head, each needs a separate camshaft or whatever. Like none of that. You have one block, and that's where all four of your cylinders are in a straight line. This is typically done for the sake of durability and efficiency. Just think about it. If you're going to be putting an engine in a car, and especially it's supposed to be a cheaper economy car, it doesn't matter if the engine's fancy. All it matters is that the engine runs, it's durable, it's efficient, and frankly, it's small enough to fit in one of those cars. I4 engines are real small, real simple. They tend to be fuel efficient, and they are really the perfect the perfect engine to put in a car of that caliber. I mean, you don't need grand power. You don't need tons of torque. You don't need a super big engine to put in your Toyota Corolla, for example. I mean, all you need is an i4 engine. It's just the go-to. It's not that big. It's not that fancy. Simple to work on, simple to construct, and it's very easy to construct tons of them, so they're very easy to mass produce. Usually used in front-wheel drive vehicles because it does not take up a lot of space when mounted transversely. Now, that's a bunch of jargon, but essentially, most economy cars are front-wheel drive, meaning that the power is sent directly to the front wheels, not the rear wheels. Front-wheel drive has its advantages that you don't need a drive line to get or drive shaft, I should say. You don't need a drive shaft to get the power from the engine in the front to the rear wheels. So thus, it is simpler, again, front wheel drive. And because the i4 engine is small and short enough, you can mount it horizontally across the front axle of the vehicle to drive the front wheels, instead of mounting it longitudinally or like vertically to drive the rear wheels like most rear wheel drive cars are. So if you have an i4 engine, typically your car is front wheel drive. That's not always the case, but like I said, these engines are used in economy cars, so efficiency is really the key here. It's also called a straight engine. Because, like I said, the cylinders are arranged in a straight line. So you can call your i4 engine an i4, you can call it a straight 4, or a slang term is a 4-banger. But I don't want to just focus on the i4 engine here. There are actually several engines that use inline cylinders. Typically, I engines are i4 engines. Maybe you might get an i3 engine in some really small cars, like I think the Ford Fiesta. One generation comes with like an i3 engine. Typically, they're i4 or i6 engines, straight 4 or straight 6. This is typically the limit of what they produce for inline engines, simply because inline engines tend to be longer than their V counterparts. So you're not going to get an inline 8 in a modern engine. I mean, you might get inline 8s in like some engines of old, like really old engines that were cars that had long hoods so that they could accommodate an engine of such size. But because of the space constraints in modern automobile design, you're not going to get inline 8 engines, inline 10 engines, even though engines of that caliber really existed in the past. But typically, inline engines are inline 4 and inline 6 engines. And even inline 6 engines are pretty long because, they're not they don't have the same space constraint just as a V engine would. These are may have even a odd number of cylinders, just like a 3, an inline 3 cylinder or an inline 5 cylinder. Inline 5 cylinders, I believe Volvo makes them. I believe Audi makes them. These are typically European engines. I mean, 5-cylinder engines are not very common in American cars. I don't think I've ever heard of an American car using a 5-cylinder engine. Maybe I believe there was an Oldsmobile back in the 80s that had a diesel engine that was a 5-cylinder, but I think that actually made it almost to production, but then was canceled for some reason. So I don't think it actually even made it. 5-cylinder engines are also very not common at all. Usually less than 3 liters in size. Inline engines tend to be small. Like I said, space constraints. You don't want super large cylinders and a super large engine block to try to stuff it into a modern vehicle. Cars of old, as you all will know, tend to be very large, and they tended to be very large than, much larger than cars today, and that includes their engines. So back then, you might have had like a Bentley 6.5 liter that was, inline 8 with, cylinder heads that required like 3 spark plugs because they were that large in order to get, and it was just, they were massive. They were overbuilt. But this is not typical of cars today. So typically an I engine is typically less than 3 liters in size, 3 liters as in like fluid displacement of the engine. This is not always the case, however, because like I said, with any rule when it comes to these things, there is always an exception. Inline engines can also be mounted at an angle, thus becoming a slant engine. These are typically called like slant 6s, slant 4s, or whatever. I mean, I remember there was a time, I believe in the 70s and the 80s, Chrysler manufactured an inline 6 engine that was placed at like a 15-degree angle. Why they placed them at angles, I really don't know. My research hadn't yielded anything of that sort. But if you hear slant engines, that's just an inline 4 or an inline 6 that has been mounted at an angle. They are more smooth than V configurations, use a better primary balance. I'm not going to get too much into the physics of all of this, but essentially because the cylinders are moving in a straight line, they tend to be balanced. The forces that the cylinders are creating as they act in this inline motion tend to be more balanced than a V configuration where the cylinder banks are at an angle and then they're acting against the common crankshaft. I mean, this tends to be more smooth than your V counterparts. For example, the reason why V4 engines aren't really a thing anymore is because they were just not smooth. And when you're not smooth and you've got counter forces acting on a car like that, especially that there's not enough cylinders to really make it worth doing any of that, you need to have balancing shafts, you need to have other things, counterweights in the engine to make sure that the vibration isn't too great for the automobile. These are some notable cars with I engines. You get the Jaguar E-Type. The Jaguar E-Type has an I6 engine with a 3.8 or 4.2 liter displacement size. The Jaguar E-Type obviously is a European car, and you will find that a lot of times in car history, whereas Americans tended to put V8s in their car, Europeans tend to put I6s. That was like the top of the line engine, if you will. It's like, an I6 engine. Because European V8s weren't ever as common as American V8s. So for you to get a performance car or a top of the line car, it typically had an I6 engine. And that was basically the European equivalent to the American V8. The 1993 to 2002 Toyota Supra, we're talking about the legendary Mark IV Supra here, had the legendary 2JZ i6 engine, known for being highly tunable. I mean, on the original engine blocks, they were able to bump out like, oh goodness, 900 horsepower for some people who tuned them years later and take these things to drag strips and other sorts of foolishness as that. I mean, it's insane what they're able to do with that 2JZ engine. And the 1908 to 1927 Ford Model T also had an I4 engine. This engine design actually far outlived the Model T. It produced 20 horsepower, and for the 19 or 20 or so years that the Model T was in production, this engine was used in all of them as far as my knowledge goes. And even in cars after the Ford Model T had been discontinued, continued to use this very simple I4 engine that produced around 20 horsepower because it was very reliable, it was very simple to work on, and it was very simple to construct as well. And just to offer some insight, I engines are really basically what's the most common. I mean, you get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, my Toyota Corolla has a V4 engine. No, it doesn't. This is actually a slight pet peeve of mine because people don't always understand that engines come in different configurations, have cylinders that are opposed differently. Some engines have advantages over others. For example, I mean, the more cylinders you have, the smoother the engine tends to run because then they have overlapping combustion patterns and firing orders. So, for example, in an I4 engines, you typically get two cylinders are firing at the same time. The two outer cylinders, just to put this in layman's terms without using the technical terms, the two outer cylinders would tend to be cylinders 1 and 4 tend to fire at the same time, and then cylinders 2 and 3 tend to fire at the same time. So you're getting the two outermost cylinders going up, like having the explosion and then being forced down, and then as they're doing that, then the ones in the middle go up, have the explosion, and then get forced down too, and that's how it continues to go. Well, when you don't have overlapping combustion patterns in the engines, it tends to not be as smooth. It tends to be kind of choppy. So even though the i4 is smoother than the V4, this is just amplified in a V4 engine when you're not having, combustion chambers that are combusting, overlapping with each other. For example, you might have in a V8 engine, cylinder 7 might go up, and as soon as cylinder 7 goes up, before it's even done, cylinder 6 goes up. So that way, there's, the explosions are a bit more controlled, and the vibration is dampened by the other, forces setting it off. That's really putting it in layman's terms, because I know this is not a physics podcast, it's a car podcast. But please stay tuned, because speaking of the V engine, that's what our next engine is, and we are going to be talking about the V engine after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, folks, after the break. This is what we discussed in segment 1. We talked about I engines. Now in segment 2, we are going to be talking about V engines, which are the second most common type of cylinder configuration. And V engines are typically what comes to mind when people think engine. Even though this is not as common as the I engine, especially here in America, for the longest while, V engines were a lot more common than any sort of engine. So I guess that's why it's become common parlance in American English, just colloquially, to refer to any engine as a V engine, because typically that's what it was, especially back in the day. Even though nowadays, with the prevalence of economy cars, with the prevalence of more fuel-efficient vehicles, I engines are far more common than V engines. But it's not like, it's not like you never see a V engine. V engines are really just as common as I engines, though I engines are probably just a bit more common than V engines, but it's not like there's a huge disparity there. So, moving on. Most V engines are either 6 or 8-cylinder variants. This is typically what you get. I mean, maybe you might get a V10, but V10s are typically very large, very inefficient. I know some Chrysler products had V10s, like the Dodge Viper had a V10 at some point. I know Ford had a V10 engine, like the Triton V10 or something, in some of their vans. I believe in I think the Ford Excursion also came with a V10 engine at some point, but those are typically very large. And as far as I'm concerned, V10 engines are only produced by American car companies. I don't ever recall hearing the Europeans ever creating a V10 engine, but if someone out there wants to correct me when I'm wrong, leave a comment and then I will be sure to read it. So yeah, V engines are typically 6 or 8-cylinder variants. Though inline engines tend to be simpler and more balanced, V engines are more compact. This is what I touched on in the last segment. Because V engines, you basically have two inline engines that are stuck together at an angle using a common crankshaft. So their cylinders don't have to be in a complete line. Their cylinders could really be exactly across from each other. So it's like you're taking an I engine and you're folding it in half. So it's going to be wider, but it's not going to be as long. So V engines typically are more compact, and when it comes to cars that are more than 4 cylinders, V engines are typically the way to go. Not to say that you don't get your I6 every now and then, and not to say that back in the old days you didn't get an I8, maybe even an I10 or an I12. I mean, cars in those days, by modern standards were absolutely insane because there wasn't any like standardization, if I could put it that way. People were all experimenting with what they could do. So you had cars with I8s, I10s, I12s, and obviously those cars are still not made anymore. And obviously they probably weren't very successful either, because you will find that when you have that many cylinders in line, things tend to happen. Things that are not very favorable, especially considering how large your car would have to be to fit an I10 or an I12 under the hood. I mean, that's ridiculous. Your hood would have to be like 6 feet long or something ridiculous. But anyway, moving on. V engines, tend to be a lot more compact than their I engine counterparts. And later on in the podcast, when we talk about W engines, you will find that they are even more compact than V engines, because it's like, again, you are folding a V engine in half this time. But anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about more of the V engines, because you will find that V engines are, have a great history behind them, especially here in America. The V engine it's like an American staple. I mean, you're not going to find your Mustang with an I6 or an I8. You're going to find your Mustang with a V8. Of course, nowadays they have like I4 Mustangs, but the original Mustang didn't have one of those, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's move on. There are, just like I said, V engines are basically inline engines that are joined together at an angle, joined by a common crankshaft. The angle that they are typically arranged at is either a 60-degree angle or a 90-degree angle. And obviously, 60-degree angle V8s are more narrow than 90-degree angle V8s, but some exceptions exist. Of course, they can be anywhere from, anywhere between 0 and 180-degree angles. Of course, obviously, you're not going to get a 0 angle V engine, because 0 angle V engines are not V engines. They are inline engines. And obviously, 180-degree V engines are not V engines. They are flat engines, if you know your basic geometry. So this is what I'm talking about. I mean, there are some exceptions, but this is typically the case, 60 or 90 degrees. V engines have 2 cylinder heads on either side of the engine. Just like I kept on saying, it's 2 inline engines stuck together by a common crankshaft. I mean, that's it. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that when you really break it down. But if you were to strip down everything from a V engine, you will find out that they are just straight engines that are joined together at an angle, joined by a common crankshaft. That's it. That's really all there is to it. I mean, it's not that complicated when you really think of it. V engines, this is some of the complicated stuff, so I'm going to explain this in the best of my ability. V engines come in overhead valve or flathead configurations. Overhead valves are typically, or actually not even typically, are essentially engines that have the valve at the top of the cylinder head. So in your regular 4-stroke engine, you have exhaust valves and you have intake valves. Exhaust valves are I should start with the intake valve. The intake valve is what allows air to come into the engine, and then as it's being intaken, then you get gas that's squirted or flowing or something, somehow, somewhere, gas is coming into the cylinder head as the air is coming in for the intake valve. Then it explodes in a controlled explosion, forces the piston down, and then the exhaust is another stroke. The exhaust has another valve that opens that lets the air out so it can travel out of your tailpipe eventually. So you get your intake valves, you get your exhaust valves. So intake and exhaust. These valves in an overhead valve engine are located on top of the cylinder head. A variation of the overhead valve is the the Hemi engine with hemispherical heads. So there is a half circle of a head on top of the cylinder, and it does something in some way that makes it more performance. I don't know, essentially. But a Hemi engine is a variation of the overhead valve. Or you can get yourself a flathead engine. Really, these are not produced anymore, but the first V8 produced in the United States, the Ford flathead engine that was produced in large numbers, was a flathead engine, and it had side valves. So essentially, your intake and your exhaust valves were on the side of the cylinder head, not at the top of the cylinder head, which caused it to have a flat head, obviously. So that's basically putting it in layman's terms. They either come in flathead variations or overhead valve variations. And these days, almost all of your V engines are going to have overhead valves because it's more efficient that way. You're not going to really find flathead V engines anymore unless you are talking about an engine of old, and those are still typically used for like hot rodding purposes. I believe like the flathead V8s have been able to be modded to like a 700 horsepower or something ridiculous, and even put in cars that are pushing 300 miles per hour. I mean, there's a lot you can do with a flathead engine, but they're just not as efficient as the engines they make nowadays. So they can also be DOHC or SOHC. So you will typically see this when you're talking about engines in cars, that they either have DOHC, which is dual overhead camshafts, or single overhead camshafts. Now, remember just a few seconds ago when I was talking about the valves. Well, in order for the valves to open, the valves must be driven by something that causes them to open. What drives the valves in an internal combustion in a cylinder engine is called not crankshaft. It's called a camshaft. So the camshafts can either be dual overhead camshafts, which means there is one camshaft for each cylinder bank and is not driven by push rods, meaning the camshaft is directly connected with the valves. So as the camshaft is spinning, then the valves are opening and closing as the camshaft lobes hit the valves and causing them to open or close. These engines tend to be a bit more complex than your single overhead cam, because a single overhead cam is basically what it sounds like. It is a single overhead camshaft. So there's one in the middle of the block, and then these engines are also, the valves are directly connected. As it's spinning, it opens up the valves. And then there are push rod engines. Push rod engines are different in the sense that the camshaft is in the middle of the engine block, and as it's spinning, then there are push rods that are attached to the valves, and then the push rod is basically what it sounds like. As the camshaft is spinning, the lobes of the camshaft are hitting the push rods. The push rods then are pushing the valves open or pushing the valves closed. Push rod engines are probably the most reliable. Essentially, they are simplest to work on. They don't offer as much performance, but they are the simplest, and they are pretty much the most reliable. Dual overhead cams are probably the least reliable, simply because there are just more moving parts and they are more complex. Some examples of engines that have dual overhead cams: Cadillac's North Star V8. An example of a push rod engine is like Ford's Coyote engine that they put in the Mustang, or Buick's 3800. And then there are single overhead cam engines like the Ford Modular V8 that was put in the Ford Panther platforms. These are typically not found in I4 engines. I4 engines could have DOHC or SOHC, but I don't think it's possible to have an I4 engine with push rods. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you kind of need a V so the camshaft could go in there and then push the push rods. But Of course, I am a car person. I know about engines, but I am not an engineer. So that's the reason why some of these things, take them with a grain of salt and do your own research. But this is basically an overview in layman's terms. So aside from a camshaft and push rods, this is where I can sort of kind of rant on my pet peeve. Because V-cylinder configuration is so common, people who are not privy to cars typically use V and the number of cylinders to speak of any engine in general. Please, folks, do me a favor. Do little old David Lucy Mabel a favor and know that this is wrong. A V engine must have the cylinders arranged in a V pattern. It is not a general term for any engine. I can remember specifically way back, not even way back, like last year, my friend James, bless his heart, James was not a car guy. He got himself a Honda Fit that had like 30,000 miles. It was in excellent condition. And he left his Mazda for his brother, and he got himself a Honda Fit. Well, when we were talking, I was like, I wonder what type of engine it has. He's like, I think it has a V4. I was like, oh no, James, your Honda Fit does not have a V4. If it's going to have a 4-cylinder engine, it's going to be an I4 engine. He's like, what do you mean by that? I was like, the cylinders are arranged in a straight line. He's like, oh, I never knew. I thought just all engines were V engines. And then he's like, no. It's an I4 engine. So, of course, now James doesn't make that mistake anymore because he knows that somewhere I'm going to pull his ear if he ever dares to say that ever again. So, yeah, that's basically the rant that I have concerning the I engines. The first V engine was a V twin engine designed by Wilhelm Maybach, and it was used in the 1889 Daimler, and I'm going to butcher this, Stahlwagen, which meant steel-wheeled car in German. The first V8 engine was created in 1903, and it was designed by Léon Lévy-Vasseur for marine and aero applications. So the first V engine was actually a boat engine, and it was actually it was an airplane engine as well. Notable V engines and cars with V engines, you get the Ford Flathead V8, produced from 1932 to 1953, one of the most famous American engines. You get the Chevrolet small block engine, produced from 1954 to 2003. It was a 90-degree angle V8. The LT1 was one of the most common versions of this, and the LT1 V8 was used in your GMB and D body cars in the 90s. So you get your Cadillac Fleetwood, you have your Chevy Caprice, your Chevy Impala SS, and your Buick Roadmaster. And the Buick V6 was produced from 1961 to 2008, commonly referred to as the Buick 3800 because it displaced 3.8 liters, and these were very reliable engines, and the supercharged version is actually used in my car, the Buick Park Avenue Ultra. So moving on, our next segment is going to be on an even less common engine called a flat engine, and sometimes flat engines are called boxer engines, and I will show to you, actually, this is not always the case, but if you would like to learn more, please stay tuned after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, car lovers. This is segment 3 of the podcast on engine configurations. So in the last segment, we discussed V engines, and in the first segment, we discussed I engines. Now, if you've been noticing a trend here, I started out with the most common form of engine, going to the next common form. Now we're going to some of the less common forms of engines. This is the flat engine, or otherwise known as the boxer engine, but that's sort of a misnomer. You will find out why that is. These are horizontally opposed cylinders. These cars are most common today produced by Porsche and Subaru. I can't think of any other car manufacturer that produces flat engines in any sort of large number, or frankly, any number at all these days. Porsche and Subaru seem to be the champions of the flat engines. And props to them. I think that they have really perfected the art. Porsche is obviously a very different car manufacturer than Subaru. There's almost no overlap in their product line whatsoever. But you will find that Porsches have maximized performance out of the flat engines, and Subaru has maximized efficiency and reliability out of the flat engines. And frankly, Porsches are known for being pretty reliable too, especially your Porsche Boxster, which is known as the Toyota Camry of the sports car world because it's just that reliable. So maybe flat four engines have an advantage over the other engines that we don't know about, but we'll find out. So flat four engines, if you're imagining this, tend to be very short and wide with a low center of gravity. Essentially, you're getting the space advantage of a V8 even more maximized, because V8 engines tend to be tall since the cylinders are standing up at an angle. But I engines tend to be very tall and very long. And flat engines tend to be very wide and very short, because as you get in the cylinders are laying down. So they're laying down, so you get the width, but you get almost no height to this engine. And because it's not very tall, it has a low center of gravity. So you might figure out why these engines are actually used in Porsches, because they have a low center of gravity, which causes the car to be able to be more balanced. Weight distribution is better, and as a result, better handling, other things that are so important for sports cars. Essentially, a flat engine, just like I had alluded to in the past, is a 180-degree V engine. If you know your physics and your mathematics and your geometry and your trigonometry and all the ometries, you will find that a 180-degree angle is a straight line. A 180-degree angle is a straight line because the angle is completely open and it is a flat angle. It is a straight angle. So that's why you get your two cylinder banks are exactly horizontally opposed from each other, because it is like a V engine, but the V is completely wide open and it is straight and it is flat. So that's why you get your horizontally opposed engines. Though terms are used interchangeably, not all flat engines are boxer engines. Here's the difference. Boxer engine cylinders move outward at the same time. So when you actually look at the firing order of a boxer engine, you will find that the cylinders on the opposite banks fire at the same time, so they're moving outwards at the same time. So when you actually look at it, it looks like the cylinders are boxing because it's like they're punching the cylinder heads on either side. So that's why it's called a boxer engine, because they're moving at the same time, and when it looks like it, it looks like they're boxing. So that's kind of a fun fact for you. There are other sorts of flat engines. The other one is called basically a 180-degree V engine, which essentially is a V8, or it's a V engine laid flat, because in a V engine, V engines are never boxer engines because the cylinders never fire at the same time. There's always a firing order that's sort of odd. The flat engines that are not boxer engines fire in the same way as a V engine, except they're horizontally opposed, they're laying flat. So essentially that's basically what the difference is. So nobody's going to kill you if you call your your flat engine a boxer engine, even though it's not, because the terms have become used interchangeably, because frankly, most flat engines are boxer engines. So all boxer engines are flat engines, but not all flat engines are boxer engines. Moving on, flat engines are most common now in the airplane industry. Maybe due to the low center of gravity. Like I said, I'm not a physicist. I wouldn't know exactly why, but it makes sense. If you're trying to keep something lightweight, you're trying to keep it balanced, it would make sense that you're going to use something with a low center of gravity for something that has to be flying. Of course, your jet engines are going to have jet engines, obviously. Your jet planes are going to have jet engines, and your big Boeing 747s and other sorts of things all have jet engines. We're talking about smaller planes that have engines in the front. Those are going to be flat engines, and they're going to be cylinder-derived as well. Porsche and Subaru remain the only manufacturers that use flat engines in significant numbers. And you will find that most flat engines are used in all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive drivetrains. I don't say that you can't have a front-wheel drive with a flat engine. You can. It's been done in the past. I think in some quirky French cars. French cars are quirky. Honestly, I should do a podcast on French cars. But you will find that maybe it's because Subaru and Porsche are typically all-wheel or rear-wheel drive anyway. But you will find that Porsche typically is rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive with flat engines, and Subaru is almost exclusively all-wheel drive with flat engines as well. So maybe that's the reason why, is because these manufacturers typically only produce those two sorts of drivetrains anyway, and they're the only ones that really produce flat engines anymore. Or maybe it's something with the flat engine itself that makes it difficult to make it front-wheel drive. So we won't actually know. But some history about the flat engine. Did you know that the first flat engine was produced by Carl Benz in 1897? I believe it was a flat two-cylinder engine as well. Not sure if it was a boxer engine, though. My research didn't yield that information. Some notable cars with flat engines. You will find that I purposely left off Porsches and Subarus off this list. So you might say, but David, the Porsche this has a flat... Yeah, almost all Porsches have flathead engines. I mean, not flathead, flat engines. And almost all Subarus have flat engines too. So I didn't bother mentioning those because almost all of them have flat engines. But you will be surprised at some of the cars that made this list. The 1938 to 2003 Volkswagen Beetle, the original Beetle that is, had a flat four engine. It was air-cooled. It was rear-wheel drive. This was mounted in the back, and it was a very simple engine to work on. Super reliable, super simple to work on, lots of tuning capability, and these engines were not just put in the Volkswagen Beetle, it was also put in the Volkswagen Karmann Ghia, and I believe the Volkswagen Bus, like the little Volkswagen vans, had the same engine too. Very sort of common little engine. This one actually really surprised me. So get this. This is the 1984 to 1996 Ferrari Testarossa. It had a mid-engined, flat 12-cylinder engine. So let me break that down. The flat 12-cylinder was rear mid-mounted, so behind the cab, but in front of the axles, in the middle of the car, and it was flat. It was a flat 12-cylinder engine. If I'm not mistaken, this might be the only 12-cylinder engine that was flat that was ever put into a Ferrari. If not, it was most certainly the last, because after this, they didn't do this sort of thing anymore. 12-cylinder engines are already crazy enough as it is. I couldn't imagine having a flat 12-cylinder engine in the middle of my car, driving my car. But it must have been a performance monster, because you get all the benefits of a 12-cylinder engine, the torque, the horsepower, the smoothness, but it's flat, so it has a low center of gravity, and you're putting it in the middle of the car, so the weight distribution is more or less even across the car. I mean, that is some proper Italian supercar engineering right there. I mean, I can't tell you if it was reliable. Most likely it wasn't reliable, but boy, I can tell you, goodness, could that car sing and could that car perform them Ferrari Testarossas. So that is amazing in itself. This was Ferrari's last car to feature a flat 12 engine. Maybe for obvious reasons. I could only imagine how complex it would be just to do a spark plug job on that thing. The engine bay is probably going to be super crowded. It's in the middle of the car. So just like typical with those supercars, if you need to do a tune-up or anything, you probably needed to drop the engine out of the car and then do it that way. And even putting it back in, I could only imagine what a headache working on a flat 12 engine would be. And considering the fact that it's Italian, it's not going to be very reliable anyway. I mean, imagine how often you would have to do service to that thing. And oh my goodness, it sounds like a nightmare. A glorious nightmare, because when it's working properly, it really runs. But a nightmare to work on nonetheless. I mean, holy smokes. But your 1903 Ford Model A, not to be confused with the 1927 to 1931 Model A, had a flat 2-cylinder engine. So you would find that actually even cars way back in the day, we're talking about still the era of the horseless carriage, you will find that there were different variations of the engine as well. The first I engine was produced in the late 1800s. The first V engine was produced in the early 1900s. The first flat engine was also produced in the late 1800s. So you will even find, even in the early days of the combustion engine, there were several different variations to be had. You had V, you had I, and you had F engines, which are flat engines or boxer engines, depending on how you choose to call them. And you will find that from the very beginning, innovation was great. Innovation was not only great, innovation was booming. Innovation was king. I mean, people who had never seen engines before were beginning to see engines, and they were just designing them in all sorts of crazy ways. I mean, in this segment, I should also mention some of the crazier cylinder engines that I saw. There's like these Deltonic engines, which are basically like free-cylinder engine. It's super difficult to explain. These are not used in automobile applications, but I thought it interesting to explain anyways. It's like the engine block is triangular, and there are 6 cylinders, I believe, in this one that I saw, and the cylinders are mounted by crankshafts in like the corners of the triangle, and as the crankshafts are spinning, the cylinders go against each other in a common the pistons go against each other in a common cylinder. So as they meet in the middle, then they spark and then they explode, forcing them out. So they're going on the sides of the triangle, and the pistons are working towards each other. I think these are called a Deltonic engine because it's shaped like a Greek letter delta, which is basically just a triangle. And those are used in like large ships and large maybe tanks and other sorts of that thing. Those are really interesting. They were without valves. They have these cylinders, but they are like common cylinders. And another simpler version of that was like an engine in which they are horizontally opposed, so the pistons are going towards each other in a common cylinder. Not used again in cars, probably used in tanks or other heavy-duty stuff. So that's really interesting how many different types of cylinder configurations there are, especially ones that are similar to the flat engine. But moving on, we're finally reaching segment 4. Segment 4 is going to be about the W engines, which are really rare, and you will find out more about W engines in the next segment. And you're going to be finding out my thoughts on some of my favorite engines of all time, and some of the ones that I've experienced, what I like, what I don't like about them. So please stay tuned after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
So, welcome back, car lovers. Hope you enjoyed that break. In segment 4, we are going to be discussing W engines. These are super uncommon. W engines are actually only reserved, really, for use in ultra cars or in airplanes. By ultra cars, I mean hypercars, like ultra high performance, ultra luxury cars. I mean, these are the ones that are using W engines or airplanes. Makes sense. I mean, they cost more than airplanes anyways, those cars. So, shorter and wider than a V8, because like I said, if a V engine is an I engine folded in half, so you have basically two of them. Like a W engine is like a V engine folded in half again on itself. So now you get it even wider and shorter than a V engine. And W engines typically have 3 to 4 cylinder banks that make it look like a W from the front of the engine if you're looking at it. This is insane. I saw a picture of a W engine, like it was like a W12 or something ridiculous like that. I mean, a W12, you take it. It has 3 cylinder banks. 12 divided by 3 is 4. So you are getting essentially 3 inline 4-cylinder engines joined together by a common crankshaft. Boy, if there's ever a nightmare for a mechanic, that would be it. I mean, imagine how heavy duty that crankshaft would have to be and how many lobes it would have to have for it to be, it's just, God gracious. I can't imagine. I can't imagine. And imagine trying to figure out cylinder firing orders and valve timing and other sorts of foolishness because you got and how many camshafts it would need to have to open up the valves. And oh my gosh, that's a nightmare to think about. I feel like a W engine would exclusively need to be a dual could it even be considered a dual overhead cam? I mean, you probably have 6 camshafts and something like that. Dual camshafts for each cylinder bank or something like that. I wouldn't even imagine. I don't know. There's no way you could have a pushrod engine on something like that. You would probably only need to have overhead cams. But I don't even know, man. And if anybody out there knows, please comment when this goes up on YouTube or send me a message or something. I mean, find out how to contact me. And if you know how W engines work, please tell me. Because upon seeing this, I was scared for my life if I were a mechanic and I had to work on something like this. Of course, I'm not a mechanic. The mechanics are probably not as scared as I am. They probably know what they're doing. So it is only really produced by the Volkswagen Group. It makes sense. It makes perfect sense that a German company would produce a car that is so horribly complicated and would produce an engine that is so horribly complicated. I was not surprised at all when I saw that only the Volkswagen Group produces W engines for cars. They actually take this and kind of run with it. They have a W8, they have a W12, and they have a W16. Wow. Just wow. But anyway, moving on. Some notable cars with W engines are the Bugatti Veyron with a W16 engine. Essentially, 2 narrow-angle V8s sharing a common crankshaft. I believe with the W16 engines, it was 2 15-angle V8s joined together by a common crankshaft. I believe that's what it was. I believe that's what it was, actually. And this is the only production W16 in the world, the only production W16 ever made. That's insane. A W16 engine. 16-cylinder engines, whether they be I16, whether they be V16, whether they be flat 16, 16-cylinder engines are overkill to begin with. And now you're going to be putting it in a W configuration for the cylinders and then taking that and running with it. I mean, wow, that is crazy. I legitimately can't imagine that. I mean, there's a reason why the Bugatti Veyron, the Bugatti Chiron, all of those Bugattis have these W16 engines because they're super expensive. They're super expensive. Wow. just wow. Anyway, let me move on before I have a stroke trying to figure this out. The Bentley Continental GT and the Bentley Continental Flying Spur have a W12 engine. W12 engine produced by the Volkswagen Group. And the Volkswagen Phaeton comes with an optional W12 as well. It came with a V8 or a W12 engine. The Volkswagen Phaeton, maybe I should do a podcast on this too. I know I'm always constantly getting podcast ideas, which is great because I'm going to be here for an entire year, so that's wonderful. But yeah, the Volkswagen Phaeton was quite the car. It was basically a Bentley, but it was a Volkswagen. As you can imagine, it did not sell very well because if people are going to be paying that much, they want a luxury brand attached to it. These cars were over $100,000 when new, and they were super luxurious, quad zone climate control. I mean, this was basically a Bentley Continental, but it was a Volkswagen. Why Volkswagen decided to produce it? I mean, it was really odd. It was super odd. I don't know why Volkswagen decided to produce the Phaeton. I think the Phaeton's wonderful because I personally like understated cars, especially an understated car that looks like an oversized Volkswagen Passat, but you could come with a W12 engine. I mean, that's insane. That's like your ultimate sleeper car. If sleeper cars are typically performance sleepers, like it just looks slow, but it's actually really fast. Well, this one looks cheap, but it's actually really luxurious, and it looks slow, but it's actually really fast. So it's like a double sleeper. It's a luxury sleeper, and it's a performance sleeper. But moving on to some of my favorite engines. So far, you've heard about I engines, you've heard about V engines, you've heard about flat engines, you've heard about W engines, and you're going to be hearing about my favorite engines. And let's start out with probably, these are the ones that I've experienced, probably the Cadillac Northstar V8. I know this is going to get a lot of hate from the car community, and the Northstar V8 is not as bad as they make it out to seem. The Northstar V8, if you're privy to car things, especially GM car culture and GM car history, you'll find that the Northstar V8 had its issues. It had a lot of issues, but it's my favorite engine simply because my first two cars had these engines in them, the 32-valve dual overhead camshaft V8 Northstar engines. Let me explain to you what a Northstar engine essentially is. The Northstar engine came to replace the HT4100 series of engines from Cadillac, like the high technology engine, I believe it was called, which HT obviously. These went out of production, I believe, in 1992. The 1993 or 1992 Cadillac Alante was the first and only year of the Cadillac Alante to get a Northstar engine, and it was the first Cadillac to get a Northstar engine. Northstar engines got a lot of hate because of several reasons. They tended to overheat because the head gaskets would go bad on them. This was a problem from the very beginning. Head bolts also typically used to get stripped out of these things because Northstar engines were produced of aluminum blocks and aluminum heads. Well, aluminum is not very heat resistant, and aluminum is a lot softer than cast iron. So when you get these engines that are softer metal, prone to overheating, and the fact that the studs on these, the screws that held on the heads to the engine block were very thin and they didn't have much tread on them, that was sort of a problem. It was a problem in the sense that if the engine, as metal heats and expands, it typically expands, and these threads would become loose and become stripped out of the head bolts, thus causing the head bolts to come out of the engine and to cause severe problems, massive engine failure. So in order for you to secure the head back onto the engine block, you had to rebore it with a more aggressive thread pattern on the screw and then drill it back in. And it was just a bunch of foolishness with that. And it was super complex being a dual overhead camshaft engine. And another thing, I've experienced this before, the alternator is on the bottom of the engine instead of the top of the engine, like a smart engine. So the North Star engine, but the reason why I love the North Star so much is because of how smooth the North Star was when it was working properly. That V8 power, I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing. My old 1997 Cadillac DeVille, Miss Faith, I remember leaving a revival with my two friends, Grant and one of his friends, Colton. And we are pulling out of the church parking lot, and I need to get over like 3 lanes of traffic. So I was like, okay, hang on. And then I floor it. And this North Star engine leapt into action and then threw us back in our seats. And Colton, who was sitting next to me, he's like, whoa. He's like, I did not expect that from this thing. I was like, oh, you'll find out. 275 horsepower and like 240-something pound-feet of, no, it's like 300 pound-feet of torque and to the front wheels. I mean, this was a monster. V8 North Star engines are a force to be reckoned with, and you find that the North Star engine was very smooth, not simple, but very smooth. And it wasn't only offered in Cadillacs; it was offered in the Pontiac Bonneville. It was offered in the Buick Lucerne. It was offered in the Oldsmobile Aurora as the Aurora V8. It was slightly smaller. The North Star was a 4.6 liter engine. It had a 4 liter engine variant, and there was even a 4.4 liter variant that was used in a rear wheel drive application later on towards the end of the North Star run. So yeah, you will find that North Star engines are actually very common, and that's why it's not that bad to own them, because if anything goes bad, they're all over junkyards because they've overheated and people don't want to use them. So parts are plentiful for these things. North Star engine is not that bad of an investment as long as you promise to take care of it. If you promise to take care of it and you treat it like the finicky engine that it is, it's going to last you. I mean, my first North Star had 172,000 miles on it when my car got wrecked, and it never gave us any serious problems. The worst thing it ever did to us was an alternator. I mean, yeah, you're going to find that your North Star is going to burn a bit of oil. You're going to find that your North Star is going to leak a little bit, especially around the oil pan gaskets, but that's just normal. That's just normal for a North Star, and considering all the other things that can go wrong with it, that's your least problem. So essentially, that's my favorite engine, and those are my thoughts on that engine. And you found out a lot about engines today, not a specific car, but a whole entire informational podcast on engines and why you should not call your I engine a V engine, because the reason why I actually did this podcast was because, again, I'm in several car groups on Facebook, and someone had misnamed engine and said I was a V engine when it was in fact an I engine, and I kind of had to rant a little bit on that. But yeah, that's why I decided to do this podcast. So I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you so much for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Car Podcast Network, not Car Podcast Network. They've got lots of other podcasts that you can listen to. So if you liked us, please leave us a like, a comment on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you may find this podcast or video when it comes out. Please leave a like and a comment. It really helps us. And thank you so much, and have a good night, folks.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.